Hello everyone, and welcome to London on a rare sunny day. This is Lincoln's Inn Fields, one of the few green spots in London. Now, why on earth am I in London? Apart from the fact I live on the southwestern edge of it. Well, the wonderful folks over on Patreon asked for a history, specifically naval history based pub crawl of London. And, well, I'm going to do a version of that. So within roughly the boundaries of central London, over the next couple of hours, I'm going to walk to a... Yes, thank you. You're going to move... Oh look, 15 yards. It was really worth the horn, wasn't it, mate? Anyway, I am going to walk up to 10 different pubs in and around what they call the Square Mile, which all either have a naval history connection in some way, shape or form, or have adopted a naval history name, which allows me to talk more about naval history. Now, of course, these aren't the only naval history themed pubs in London, let alone even in the Square Mile. There's also what they call the Maritime Mile over in Greenwich, but maybe that's for another video if this one proves relatively popular. And as for the question of why I'm walking, well, as you probably guessed from the mini road rage incident there, London, hundreds of years ago, used to be a walking city, and nowadays, with the level of traffic that there is, it pretty much still is a walking city if you actually want to get anywhere fast during the daytime. So with that said, let's go to our first destination. Right, well, this is our first pub. You can see behind me the black shape. This is the Ship Tavern. Well, the ship is not particularly descriptive, but it has been here a while. So this tavern is first recorded as having been on this site in the mid-1500s, 1549 to be precise. And, well, it's been here pretty much ever since. Now, we are a little bit north of the river. If you look up the Ship Tavern on Google Maps, you'll see we're a little way from the Thames, which you think is the main naval-related element of London. However, what we are quite close to is Fleet Street, more latterly associated with newspapers, but back when this pub was set up, it was in fact the River Fleet, one of the many tributaries to the Thames that flow through London that don't exist anymore, or more precisely, they don't exist on the surface. Over time, most of the tributary rivers were literally paved over, but they still run 6, 10, 12 feet, however many feet further beneath our feet. But at the time that the Ship Tavern was established, as I said, the River Fleet was an open river, and thus it was actually the site of a number of boatyards, dockyards, and even shipyards, because although it's not a particularly large river by those standards of the time or by the standards of today, it could still support a fair number of riverine and even what counted for at the time, oceanic craft, both in construction and maintenance. And so it became something of a haven, not only for local workers from the fields and so forth, because this was right on the edge or outside of London, depending on the exact time period you're looking at early on in its history, but also for various ship owners, the crew, and let's just say some nefarious smuggling activities as well. Speaking of nefarious smuggling activities, it was also the base of a holdout of Catholic priests during the late Tudor period, when, well, the Catholic Church wasn't particularly popular with the monarchy. Obviously, as the fleet was paved over and this area has just been urbanised, it's just retained its name, the Ship Tavern, but it is one of London's oldest continuously standing pubs, although it was rebuilt in the 1920s, and as a result, I thought it would be a good inclusion to start us off. Right, well, you join me at, well, near Pub 2. We are in London's Trafalgar Square, and yes, you can probably see down there, that's Whitehall. You can probably just about see the tower containing Big Ben. I am in unfortunately close proximity to the country's politicians. I can already feel my skin crawling. But where I was supposed to be taking you is, that construction site. Because just on your left, I think, once I flip this image around, should be the Admiralty pub. Well, clues in the name. Now, that's actually not a very old pub. In fact, the building isn't very old either by central London standards, only built in the 1870s, but it was built as a bank. It was only turned into a pub within, well, my living memory. Unfortunately, as you can see, as I said, it has been turned into something of a construction site, And that has also taken out another part of what I want to show you. So the majority of the construction site, the big arc of white behind me, that is Admiralty Arch. And for over a century, that was a combination of offices for the Admiralty and the residence of the first Sea Lord, hence the pub then taking the name Admiralty from Admiralty Arch. It's also the entrance to the Mall, the National Mall, which is this end, so this will be the eastern end of the long stretch down to Buckingham Palace, where the King occasionally resides. So, although that Admiralty Arch had a very long and storied history back in the day of hosting First Sea Lords, Admiralty officers, all sorts of things, and the Admiralty probably a good one to talk about. Unfortunately, it is all a construction site. I could get a bit closer, but it's also a very loud construction site, and well, we're on Trafalgar Square, which is pretty loud already. However, I can also talk to you about something else that's on Trafalgar Square, which, to the surprise of no one, you can see the base of it there. There is good old Nelson on Nelson's Column in the middle of Trafalgar Square, of course, erected after the Battle of Trafalgar. And he is looking out towards Trafalgar, or so the legend goes, up there on his lonely perch, where pretty much his only visitors are the occasional pigeon, which is a little bit unfortunate. But somebody, yeah, this is what you have to deal with when you're walking through London. Nonetheless, there are a few other interesting things around here on Trafalgar Square. There's various embassies. I don't think anyone particularly cares about them unless you need a visa. You do not need a horn. You've gone 10 yards, stop it. There's the National Portrait Gallery, which is on the other side of Trafalgar Square, kind of behind that bus, which does house some rather interesting bits of naval art. It's much better than the Tate Modern, trust me. And also, you can see at the base of Nelson's Column in Trafalgar Square, which is this sort of big black square to, I believe it's probably going to be your left, that is in fact a mural of Trafalgar. So let's go and have a bit more of a look at that now. So here is one side of the base of Nelson's Column. This is of course commemorating the victory at Trafalgar itself, this particular panel. And it's depicting the moment that Nelson, having been shot, is being taken down to the orlop deck of Victory. So you can see there Nelson being carried in the middle, a few other wounded and or dying men. There's just the back of a gun carriage poking out at the bottom right, because of course this is up on the open deck where the guns are still being fought. You've got people trying to move, possibly hoist sail, possibly move some of the rigging. You can see one of the yard arms has come down. And over on the left, something just to note, a few of you commented on a dry dock I did recently about equality and egalitarianism in the Royal Navy. Yes, that is a black sailor holding a musket, and you can see from his uniform he is just a fairly normal regular seaman participating in the action. This, of course, completely normal for the Napoleonic Wars era Royal Navy. The colour bar and the more pronounced racism that you get later on only comes in towards the very end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, lasts for about 3 to 4 decades. And then coming around anti-clockwise, you have another panel. This is celebrating Nelson's victory at Copenhagen. So apologies to any Danish viewers, but Copenhagen is definitely there. As you can see, it does need a little bit of a clean as well. So Copenhagen 1801 there. Nelson, of course, slightly more intact in this one, albeit at this point he has already lost his eye and his arm. This one, unfortunately, I can't get you too close to because for some bizarre reason they fenced this side off. But that panel commemorates the Battle of the Nile. I'll be trying to zoom in a little bit on that in a second. But of course, in this one, actually, Nelson is almost not in as bad a shape, at least ostensibly, as he is on the Trafalgar one, because as you can see at this point, he is actually in the process of sitting down and being supported because he was wounded at the Nile. It turned out to be a relatively superficial head wound, but head wounds bleed a lot and he thought he had been killed. A little bit of a hypochondriac, although in the end he was of course right. And here we have the final panel, which is of course the Battle of St. Vincent, 1797, and Nelson accepting the surrender of the 2 Spanish ships of the line that he boarded. And this is the only panel of the 4 in which Nelson has both eyes and both arms. And just a few minutes walk down the road from Trafalgar Square. Get the sunglasses back on. Yeah, unfortunately the massive racket from the roadworks seems to have started up and is unending, but there you go. Anyway, this is the Ship and Shovel near Charing Cross Station. As you might guess from the construction, these two pubs, now one pub, started out as a pair of terraced houses, but were very quickly acquired by two different publicans and turned into two different pubs, the Ship and the Shovel. There are plenty of pubs called the Ship in London, but after a while they decided that they were going to merge the pubs. So relatively recently in their history, a tunnel was dug which actually connects the two underneath the street here, and they became the Ship and Shovel, the UK's only pub that is in fact in two separate buildings on opposite sides of the street. Now the Ship obviously is a relatively generic title, but the Shovel, which you can see there, this has two competing origin stories. Some claim that it commemorates the coal shovelers, because we're now much closer to the River Thames, so the coal shovelers would of course be from the age of steam, the 19th century and early 20th century. However, as you can probably guess from that signboard, and to be honest from the age of the pubs, these are pretty old pubs dating back to the 1700s. I think it's far more likely the second option, that being it's commemorating Admiral Sir Cloudesley's shovel, is by far the most likely, especially given it's right next to a pub that at the time was separate and called the Ship. And Admiral Cloudesley's shovel was a fairly accomplished Royal Navy officer. He fought in multiple engagements in the Anglo-Dutch Wars. He then fought in the War of Spanish Succession against a variety of enemy fleets. He was also part of the capture of Gibraltar at the very beginning of the 1700s. But unfortunately he came to grief on his return to the UK when most of his fleet ran into the Scilly Isles due to errors in navigation. And if that sounds familiar to you, that's because I actually covered the whole crash into the Scilly Isles and the death of many hundreds of people, including Admiral Cloudesley's shovel, at the start of my video on the navigational clocks of one Mr. Harrison, because that was the crash that, if nothing else, prompted the chain of events that would lead to the development of the world's first proper naval clocks. And here we come to our next pub. I kid you not, after standing around for half an hour waiting for those roadworks to go away at the previous one, the Ship and Shovel, about 2 seconds after I wrapped up filming and walked off, everything stopped. So it was nice and quiet. Nonetheless, here we are at pub number 4. This, as you probably guessed, is the Lord Nelson, and don't let the exterior appearance fool you. This has both history and really good food. So the reason I've chosen this one when we've just been at Trafalgar Square is that this reflects another aspect of commemoration of Trafalgar. This is on Nelson Square. There's the road sign just there. Or at least it was Nelson Square. It was Nelson Square with a pub called the Lord Nelson in 1807, just a couple of years after the Battle of Trafalgar. And what actually happened was that during the immediate aftermath of Trafalgar, very large numbers of British pubs and British locations either took on a Trafalgar name or a Nelson name or a Victory name. You can guess why. In commemoration of everything to do with Trafalgar. Now, a lot of that has been gradually wiped out by either pubs going out of business, name changes, redevelopment, etc., etc. And sort of is the case here, because as you saw, Nelson Square isn't a square anymore, it's a road. And well, all else aside, this is not an 1807 pub. This is in fact attached to what you can probably see behind me is this block of flats, I would say. And all of this is a result of the Blitz. Thanks very much, the Luftwaffe. So the pub and the area around it were badly damaged by a Luftwaffe bombing raid during World War II. And then in the post-war environment, they built this shocking great block of flats here, and the pub managed to finagle actually staying. But as a result of building the block of flats and various other buildings around here, the square was also deleted. So we have the road Nelson Square that isn't a square, and this pub, the Lord Nelson, which has, as I say, has been a pub for over 200 years, but in its current iteration, the actual building itself is a little bit under 100 years old. Don't let exterior appearances fool you. This genuinely has not only one of the widest, but one of the best ranges of burgers and best quality of food in all of London that I have experienced so far. And you might think, well, Drac, how on earth do you know what the burger quality in this slightly random pub in the middle of Southwark looks like, or tastes like? Well, that's because, you see, this glass monstrosity behind me, that is the TfL building, and that's where I used to work in my second to last job. Well, second to last office job, I should say, before I started doing naval history full time. So there you go, a little bit of history about Lord Nelson, the Lord Nelson pubs generally, and also about Lord Nelson, Victory and Trafalgar pubs as a whole. This is one of actually with the very few survivors. So onwards to our next destination. Well, here we are at our fifth pub, and this is the Shipwrights Arms, named not so much for coat of arms, but literally for the strength of the Shipwrights Arms. And you might be wondering, well, what's this doing at London Bridge? Well, this is London Bridge Station, but if we go down here, we'll see why this pub was so named. The pub itself, again, is a late Victorian building, but very appropriately named and located. And that's because if you walk 2 minutes down the road street that we were just on, you end up here. This is at the edge of the River Thames, and you probably spotted in the background, that is Tower Bridge. So we are now standing next to what's called the London Pool, which is the last stretch of the Thames that can be accessed by large ocean-going craft, particularly in the age of sail, large ocean-going craft that couldn't step down or fold down their masts. Dutch barges, for example, could, and therefore could proceed further upriver. Tower Bridge, another Victorian invention, was put there with its raising bascules specifically to continue to allow access of tall and large vessels into the London Pool, because swinging over around here, just up the river, you can probably just see, is London Bridge. And London Bridge is a much lower bridge, and therefore big vessels can't really pass it. Also, back when we're talking about the old school London Bridge, that was a very, very narrow set of arches, and there was a huge amount of tidal racing there as well. But what that meant was that although the London Docklands are further down that way, and obviously you can just about see the skyscrapers of what's now the London Financial District there, the Docklands are where most of London's trade was conducted, but warehousing, shipbuilding, ship repair, and indeed trade did still occur in this area. So this is within the bounds of the square mile. And so it was a very, very important area, hence why the Shipwrights Arms is so named. Oddly enough, given that that's a late Victorian building, shipwrights activities along this stretch of the Thames, despite having gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years, were at the time of the pub's construction actually pretty much dying art. And various dockyards, including royal dockyards, along this stretch of the Thames and slightly further downstream, would be closing during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, or massively reducing their output. Nowadays, in the London Pool, there is, of course, HMS Belfast, the town class light cruiser. Someone should really write a book about her. Oh wait, I did. On to the next. Right, we're now back north of the river and also east of central London, the square mile, the old city of London, whatever you want to call it. And we're outside a place called the town of Ramsgate. And you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, why is there a pub in London called the town of Ramsgate when Ramsgate is over all the way on the coast? Well, it's a good question, but it has to do with the fact we are just east of the city. You see, there's a rather famous fish market in London, not Smithfield's, that's the meat market, Billingshurst, I believe it's called, or Billing something anyway. Now, if you wanted to land fish to sell there, then obviously you'd want to land them as close as possible, which meant landing them in the city. However, if you landed them in the city, of course, you would have to pay the city docking taxes, because obviously everyone has to try and make money out of these kinds of things. And, well, the fishermen who come up from Ramsgate with all their fish didn't particularly want to pay a middleman a bunch of money to sell their fish, and so they would land them around here. This is Wapping, for those of you who are interested. And because this was outside of the city limits, you didn't have to pay this. Where all these cars come from all of a sudden, I don't know. Because you were outside of the city limits, you didn't have to pay the docking fees of the City of London. And then, of course, it was a little bit of a trek having to cart your fish from here to the market, but the amount of time that you expended and effort that you expended doing so was more than compensated for by the taxes that you saved. And so the association with the town of Ramsgate came to be with this pub, because the River Thames is just the other side of the building. Now, as far as when this pub came about, it's been through quite a few different names. The town of Ramsgate is a, relatively speaking, in its lifetime, recent one, but it's still several hundred years old. Officially, this is another pub that dates from the mid-1500s, but there are some records that indicate there was another pub on this site from the mid-1400s, and this pub is a direct continuation of that one, but we don't have specific evidence to back that up. Therefore, we can say definitively it's been here since the 1540s. It might even have been here since the 1460s, but that latter bit is a little bit of speculation pending further research. And literally just, well, what, a 5-minute walk, if that, further downstream, is the Captain Kidd pub. And we're actually literally just down the road from the London Maritime Police headquarters. And there's more traffic, of course there is. I really am not having much luck. So yeah, that's where the London Maritime Police headquarters are, because this part of Wapping is still very much associated with the river and, to a certain degree, the sea. So the Captain Kidd pub used to be a warehouse of all things. Here comes a bus. Yeah, as I was saying, used to be a warehouse. The back end extends all the way out to the river, and of course was named not for Billy the Kid in Australia, but for Captain Kidd the pirate, who, when he was caught, was taken to Execution Dock, which is just a little bit that way, and hanged for being a pirate, left there as a warning to all other pirates. And you might wonder, well, why are they hanging him all the way up the Thames in London? Well, two reasons. Partly, it's a warning, and lots of mariners frequent this area, even if they are mostly oceanic. And secondly, a lot of the ships that he'd predated on had, in some way, shape or form, had connections to London, either owned by London merchants, had traded or home ported in London, were carrying goods from London, or potentially have been insured in London. So this pub, although it's only been a pub rather than a warehouse for a relatively short amount of time, converted in the 20th century, it has, as a building, maritime connections, as a warehouse that would have received and distributed goods from ships docked on the river, and of course now carries the name of a famous pirate who was executed just nearby, and there's plenty of stuff inside which will tell you his story, and the story of the pub and the Docklands, which we're now fast approaching. And here we are at pub number 8. This, as you can see, is the Prospect of Whitby. The Prospect of Whitby, named after a collier, as shown on the little tavern sign above. Now, the reason why this pub is quite notable is not only are we maybe a 5 to 10 minute walk from the other two that we were just at a minute ago, but this theoretically is the oldest riverside pub or tavern in London, definitively dating back to 1520. So you can see why the Ramsgate one, the two pubs down, is in a little bit of competition, because the Ramsgate one could take the title if it was conclusively proved to date back to 1460. But right now, as far as absolute conclusive proof, around about 1520 for the Prospect of Whitby is the oldest pub that we can actually. But for now, 1520 with the Prospect of Whitby is the oldest pub that we can definitively prove here on the riverside. Now, it wasn't always called the Prospect of Whitby. I swear, I hang around and there's no traffic, and by the time I'm set up, suddenly all the traffic shows up, and of course this area is cobbled, which means a lot of noise from the traffic. Anyway, Prospect of Whitby, as I said, went by a number of different names. Initially called the Pelican, which those of you who are nautically minded will know is also the name of Drake's ship before it got turned into the Golden Hind and completed its circumnavigation of the world. Also near Executioner's Dock, as with Captain Kidd just down the road. And the Prospect of Whitby changed names multiple times until the 19th century early 20th century collier that docked near here, bringing in coal from Whitby for London, basically hung around so much that they changed their name to reflect the ship. So plenty of old pubs around here, but now it's time to head back south of the river into Rotherhithe, where hopefully there will be less cobbling and less traffic, where we will see pubs 9 and 10. And here we come to our penultimate pub, just here. This is the Mayflower. This is also a very, very old pub, dating back to the mid to late 1500s. And as the name might suggest, it has a connection with the Mayflower, the ship that set off, of course, to start what would eventually become the 13 colonies, which would eventually become the United States of America. So a relatively important affair, all things considered. Now, we are actually just on the south side of the Thames in Rotherhithe. The Thames is literally on the other side of these buildings, but the buildings go right up to the riverside, hence why we're in this street here. And the Mayflower at the time was very originally called the Ship. It has its own jetty, though. And moored on that jetty, of course, way, way, way back, was the Mayflower. And the reason she was down here at Rotherhithe was much like those other pubs we saw over in Wapping. We are just downstream of the city, so didn't have to pay exorbitant mooring fees and taxes and so forth while I was waiting for all these passengers to come aboard. Now, of course, those of you who have heard the traditional pop culture story of the Mayflower, she sails from Plymouth over to America, or will become America, etc., and so on. And yes, that is technically true. She started her final leg of the voyage to America in Plymouth, but she actually started her voyage period here in Rotherhithe. She then moved around the coast and eventually reached Plymouth, from which she then launched out into the Atlantic. So a fairly important place for the Americans. And of course, I have a little bit of family history that is associated with the Mayflower, and, well, therefore, technically this pub, because on my paternal grandmother's side, way, 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 way back, of course, she has a direct ancestor named William Brewster. And those of you who are scholars of the Mayflower voyage will know that Brewster was the, not priest, but friar, deacon, basically the vicar, maybe. I can't remember exactly what the title is, but he was the spiritual head of that particular voyage. So he was a Puritan. One of his grandchildren, however, decided this whole going to America thing was a bad idea and came back to the UK, hence why I was born here in the UK, amongst other things. But you know, that's just a little bit of family history of me for your edification. Now, of course, the ship went on as a pub for several hundred years. It was renamed the Spread Eagle, and then in the 1950s, they decided to rename it the Mayflower. So for the majority of its history, it's not been the Mayflower, but the Mayflower always sets sail from that wharf. Also of interest to those of you of a maritime historical bent, if we just take literally a less than 20-second walk, is, if I spin around here, the Brunel Museum, which is this little building just here. Now, this is not, in fact, the Museum of Isambard Kingdom Brunel. This is primarily a museum related to his father, who Isambard Kingdom Brunel worked for in his earlier years, because this is the southern end of the Thames River foot tunnel that his father set out to organise and build, and which Isambard Kingdom Brunel worked on. And they built a small museum about it right here in South London. Now it's time to head off for our final pub of the day. And our final pub for this little tour is the Ship Aground in Bermondsey. Now, this is in an area formerly known as Dockhead, because, well, there were an awful lot of docks here, again, just downstream of the City of London. And this area was known for a lot of barge building, barge repairs, barge decommissioning, ship repairs, ship decommissioning, a little bit of shipbuilding, a lot of trade in timber, manufacture of rope, which is, of course, vital for rigged ships, and a lot of general cargo movement, although the building, repair, and ship materials industry was certainly probably the strongest element of this particular area of just outside the City of London. Now, the Ship Aground is of a little bit uncertain date, because we know that there was a pub in this vicinity in the early to mid 1700s. The reason we know that is because in the 1780s, the license was renewed or a new license granted, which indicates obviously there had to have been an old license for this new one to supersede. Then later on, the pub was found to be in a poor state of repair, and it was pulled down and relocated to where it is now. And then some of the old timbers were used to build the structure you vaguely see behind me, which of course has been renovated and repaired numerous times since. And it seems to have actually gone by the name of the ship aground for quite a long time. The earliest we can attest to that is the mid to late 1800s, when there's actually a specific notation in the license that says this is the pub or tavern known as the ship aground. And the reason for the name is essentially because, well, there were a lot of ships aground in this area. As I said, ship building, ship and barge repair, and ship and barge decommissioning were significant industries around here. And that meant that very often ships that had essentially been abandoned or sold for breaking up could be found sitting on the Thames mudflats, either awaiting their fate, or if they were too far gone to even not really be worth the time and effort of breaking up, just quietly rotting away. And so, as with most pubs associated with maritime history, it kind of adopted the name of something appropriate to the local setting. Now, the other thing you've got to remember is that when all of this was occurring, the Thames was a much wider river than it is these days. If you walk through London, as we have been doing today, crisscrossing the Thames, although the Thames is relatively wide, if you go to somewhere like the Danube or the Rhine or the Seine outside of central Paris, then you'll see that those rivers seem to be much, much larger. And while the Thames isn't necessarily the largest river in Europe in terms of width or through flow, it was considerably larger than it is now, because the Thames has gradually been narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. First by just general development. People build lots of piers and wharves and jetties and so forth, and they get so dense that eventually they would silt up, and old ship hulks and stuff would be brought in. There'd be a little bit of deliberate expansion, but mostly it was just organic. The other thing, of course, is that with any kind of large natural river like the Thames, there would be a lot of low-lying floodplain, and that got built on and filled in. And so the Thames gradually became narrower and narrower, and then in the 19th century, there was a bit of a problem because the Thames was pretty much an open sewer, and the stink got so bad that, well, initially the Victorian solution wasn't to address the reason why the river stank. The solution was just to build what's now called the embankment, which was quite literally a massive embankment that was designed to just move the river away from all the places like Parliament that were complaining of the smell. Of course, that didn't actually solve the problem, so in the end they had to get a big London sewer system built, which is still pretty much 80–90% of the backbone of the existing London sewer system, because at that point London was a city of 2 million, but it was built with a capacity for a city of 8 million. London is a little bit bigger than that now, but for well over a century, that bit of foresight kept London going. And weirdly enough, most of the Victorian system is actually the bit that still works. It's all the stuff that's been added to it that fails, because that stuff only has a lifespan of 20 years or so. But we're getting a little bit off topic. The ship aground, a good appropriate place, I think, to end our little tour of maritime pubs of London, or at least in and around the square mile. If you've enjoyed this, let us know in the comments below, because as I said, there are a few other areas we could go north of the river. Could go down to Greenwich, to the Maritime Mile, and a few other places I can think of as well, but that's only if you want me to. So, let us know in the comments below, and see you again in another video soon.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.
As I said, don't let the exterior appearance of this place fool you. It genuinely has one of the widest range of burgers in all of London, and absolutely one of the best. Someone coming past with music. Anyway, now, as I said, don't let exterior experiences fool you, because more people singing. Now, as I said, don't let exterior experiences